Hi, I'm Chelsea at Friday Pattern Company, and today we're going to be going over my favorite seam finishes, or I guess not favorite, but like most necessary seam finishes that you're going to want to have in your mental toolbox for sewing. And there are a ton of ways to finish a seam, and these are the 5 that I find the most necessary and that I use the most. Like 99% of the time, it's one of these that I'm using. So yeah, I just wanted to share those with people who may be just getting started with sewing or want to like gain a little bit more confidence on how they can bring their sewing to the next level. Yeah, so we will go over 5 seam finishes and also kind of what a seam finish is. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. Let's get started. Okay, so first we need to understand what a seam allowance is. So a seam allowance is added to a sewing pattern, and it is the fabric between where you're going to sew and the edge of the fabric. So for most patterns, this is built in when you get the pattern, and it varies. The size of the seam allowance varies based on the pattern. So the most common 3 that you'll see are 3/8 inch, 5/8 inch, or 1/2 inch. 1/2 inch is a little bit less common, but it's out there. So you need to know what the seam allowance is on your sewing pattern, and that is the distance that you are going to sew from the edge of the fabric when you are assembling your garment. One other thing that you're going to want to consider is that some sewing patterns don't have a seam allowance built into them, and they should note this if it's not in there, and that means that you'll have to trace the pattern piece and then draw on your seam allowance around the outside using a ruler, and in that case you can decide what you want your seam allowance to be. So when you're choosing what seam allowance you want to do, there's a few things you need to keep in mind, which are what type of fabric you're using, like the weight of the fabric, how unravelly it is, how loose the weave is. You'll want to keep in mind what the garment is for. So like if it's workwear or something that's going to be getting a lot of wear, you're going to want a really durable fabric, and what tools you have at your disposal. So if you have a serger, if you have the extra bias tape, if you have whatever, even time. And then another consideration is whether or not you're going to see the seams. So are they going to be visible when you're wearing it? Like, will it be something that's open where you're going to see the seams on the inside of your garment, like as you're moving around? So just things to keep in mind. So we're going to cover zigzag stitch finish. Sorry, I'm looking over my staples. Serged finish, French seam, bias bound seam, and a flat felt seam. And I'll kind of go over with each of those what the pros and cons are for each of these seams, and then also when you're going to want to use it and how to do it. The first stitch that I wanted to go over is the zigzag stitch. So this is probably the most basic, easiest to do one, and it's a great one to have kind of in your toolbox for when you are sewing. This is it's quick, it's easy, it doesn't take any extra tools, which is all really great. It is less durable than some of the other finishes, and it does have a less professional looking look to it, but it's still totally great and something that I use a lot. So you're going to start by sewing your pieces together on the seam line and right sides together, and for this one I'm using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So we have our piece sewn together and the seam pressed open, and we're ready to finish the raw edges. So I'm just setting one edge of the seam allowance, just getting that raw edge centered right under the needle, and I have my machine set to a zigzag stitch at 2.5 millimeters by 2.5 millimeters. This is up to you. Some people do it wider, narrower, and I like to sew just right on the edge where one of the stitches is going off the edge of the fabric. Some people do the zigzag stitch where they actually stitch on the seam allowance and then trim away just right up to it, and it kind of ends up creating the same effect. I just think that this is a little easier, and yeah, I like doing it this way. And you'll repeat that on both seam allowances. The second seam I want to go over is the serge stitch, which is amazing and I love it, and this is what I do for a lot of my seams. The biggest barrier to entry with serge stitches is that you're going to want to have a serger. Sewing machines do have overlock stitches on them, some of them, and those are great. It's not the same as serging with a serger. It's really nice because the serger will trim down your seam allowance and fully encase the raw edge all in one go. So it's a lot faster. It's like super durable and great. It has its limitations like any other seam finish. It's kind of hard to, you can serge around curves, but if there's a strong pivot in the piece or anything like that, it can be harder to get around those edges. But you know, I think it's great, and it looks like a ready-to-wear garment on the inside. And you'll want to follow the instructions for your specific serger, but basically once you have it threaded up, you can just run your raw edge underneath the serger. Sergers kind of suck the fabric under rather than lifting a presser foot and lining it up. So you'll just serge down to the bottom of the raw edge, and then you can just sew a long tail of thread and flip it around and do the other side, and then you have an easy peasy finish. The next finish that I want to go over is the French seam, and the French seam is gorgeous, amazing. We love it. We feel like we're couture makers when we do it, but it has its limitations. It doesn't work as well around curves, or, you know, it doesn't pivot super well. Like if you have, you know, a piece that's going like this, it's not really suitable. Also, if a lot of seams are intersecting, it can get pretty bulky. You can't use it for seams that have gathers, but when you can use French seams in a garment and you have the time and the desire to do so, it's a really beautiful finish, and you know, I just love doing it. I feel very fancy. It's also very durable. It's a encased seam finish, so everything is encased on the front and back. There's no raw edges anywhere, and this really improves the durability and, you know, the longevity of your garment. Unlike the other finishes, we're going to start by sewing our pieces wrong sides together. So I have those marked, and because I'm using a 5/8 inch seam allowance here, my first seam that I sew of the French seam will be at 3/8 of an inch. If your seam allowance is not 3/8 of an inch, it's going to be different, and I'll leave the breakdowns of what those would be for the different seam allowances in the description box. So you'll sew to the bottom, and then you have that first pass done. Now we'll head over to our iron. So you're just going to want to give your seam a press, and then we are going to trim the seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch, and you really have to get it down short, or else you're going to have trouble on the next step. Next, we will open it up and press it flat. So I'm just pressing the seam to one side, and then I'm flipping it over so that my pieces are right sides together, and then giving that a press so that we're ready to sew our next pass. Now we're going to sew the second pass of our French seam. So this one for a 5/8 inch seam allowance is going to be a 1/4 inch. So we'll just sew a 1/4 of an inch from the edge of our fabric. And there's your beautiful finished French seam. Looks so good. So yeah, no raw edges anywhere, fully encased. The fourth seam finish that I want to talk about is bias bound seams. These are great for anywhere where you're gonna see the seam, like with jackets and things like that, where they might open up and then you'll get a peek of the seams. It gives you a high-end look, and it gives a little extra design, because you could use like matching bias tape or contrasting, but it's fun when you get like a peek of this contrasting thing. This is also a super durable finish. I love how it looks. Some limitations of the bias bound seam are that you have to have bias tape, so you can make bias tape or you can buy it pre-packaged. The ones that I'm using on this are a 1/4 inch double fold, so that means that this is like folded in and the finished width is a 1/4 inch, and then you also, it takes a little bit longer, and this also is not going to be great for anything that if you don't want to see the bias tape. So if it's a sheer fabric, it's going to show through and you don't want to see it, or it also adds bulk. So I think it's good for like mid to heavyweight projects, because then you're not at risk of seeing the bulk of the seam through the fabric when you're wearing it. Yeah, but it's a gorgeous little seam. So for this finish, you'll sew your pieces right sides together, and then you're gonna grab your bias tape. You'll notice on store-bought bias tape that one side is shorter than the other, and you want to wrap it around the raw edge of your seam allowance so that that shorter side is facing up. Here we are at the machine, and we are just going to wrap the bias tape around the raw edge of the seam allowance and edge stitch it in place. You'll make sure that everything is pushed out of the way so you're just sewing on the bias tape and the seam allowance when you sew it. And if you have that shorter edge on top, you'll be safe from accidentally missing the underneath layer of your bias binding. So you'll sew down one side and then trim it, and then you'll sew the other side. Here is that finished, and doesn't it just look so lovely? The last seam that I want to go over is the flat felled seam, and this is a super durable but also decorative stitch. So I actually don't use this very often, but it's nice to know how to do it because I think it can add like something really cool when you do it. It's most commonly used on like jeans or you know, side seams of shirts, things like that. But it's another encased, fully enclosed seam, so you don't see any raw edges on the front or the back. It's really nice how it lays, but it can't be used everywhere. So it's great for side seams, it looks great on jeans. Again, it's super sturdy and durable, but you know, it can't, because of the way that it lays, it's just not going to be suitable for everything. So like with the French seam, we're going to start by sewing our pieces wrong sides together, and then now I have that and I'm just pressing the seam open. And then you're going to choose the side that you want your seam to fall towards, and you're going to trim that side of the seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. Now you're going to press the seam allowance that you left long towards the seam allowance that you left at 1/8, or that you trimmed down to 1/8 of an inch, and then we are going to press that long seam allowance, the raw edge of it, under 1/4 of an inch. And I'm really sorry, but somehow I didn't film this part, so you'll see it in the next step, but press that raw edge under 1/4 of an inch. Here we are at the sewing machine, and I do have that the edge of the seam allowance pressed under 1/4 of an inch, and we are just going to line it up under the presser foot and edge stitch 1/8 of an inch from that folded edge all the way down. And what you're looking at here facing up is the right side of the fabric. And here is that finish. Anyway, I hope that that was a helpful tutorial video for you. I would love to make more content for beginning sewists, people who want to get more confident with sewing. So if there's anything that you would love a video about, leave it in the comments below, and yeah, have a great day.